The Tower of London today is considered a horrific fortress linked to imprisonment, torture, and execution. Within the walls of the iconic tower are many different stories of suffering, especially linked to the Tudor period. But the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula is found next to the Tower Green, which has been considered to have been the execution site of queens and many prominent people. But there are over 1,000 people's bodies and remains inside of the chapel, interred under the floor and also in the crypt. The most prominent woman who lost her head inside of the tower was the Queen Anne Boleyn, and she was buried in the same place as the fifth wife of Henry VIII Catherine Howard, a woman who was also married to her husband years after her death. The pair both lost their heads on the executioner's scaffold next to the chapel, but a forgotten queen, who is also buried inside the chapel alongside the other two women, is Lady Jane Grey, the 9-day queen who lost her head during the reign of Queen Mary I. But this means that there are 3 queens of England who were all executed, who share the same grave and burial place, and they lay metres away from each other. But the story of this is much darker than you could ever imagine. Anne Boleyn was executed inside of the Tower of London on the 19th of May 1536, and one thing that became apparent was that there was no preparation for her burial. It was rather rushed, and as she had been declared a traitor, it was said that she was not allowed a funeral and also a memorial service. She was to be quietly buried, and Henry VIII had shown, allegedly, some mercy to his wife, as he had ordered the summoning of a French swordsman to come to England to take his wife's head, rather than using the axeman of London to perform the job. Anne died by sword, which was said to have been more reliable and effective than the axe, and her head was taken off in one swift strike from the sword of Calais' weapon. But little thought had been given to what to do after her head had been taken off. Her body was not released to her family, and her ladies-in-waiting then climbed on the scaffold to gather up her body and her head, and they collected this inside of an elm trunk or an oak chest, which had been used to store arrows and bows. This was then used for Anne's coffin, and she was then carried into the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, next to the scaffold site, and she was then thrown inside of a hastily buried grave. We don't know too much as to how Anne's remains were treated, and whether a quiet and small funeral ceremony was held for her. It was the Constable of the Tower of London who was responsible for the burials and also the executions, and the ladies-in-waiting had also wrapped Anne's body in a cloth before it was buried in a shallow grave in front of the high altar. She was also buried next to, or close to, her brother's body, who had died days before, being implicated in the same charges as Anne, and George Boleyn lost his head on Tower Hill. But later, Anne's remains would be exhumed. Katherine Howard was the fifth wife of Henry VIII, who had come years after Anne Boleyn, but she had a very tragic life, and it's believed today that Catherine was the victim of the manipulations of many men who abused her and groomed her, including the King, Henry VIII. Catherine was a teenager when she was embroiled in a scandal where she was accused of sleeping with the King's closest courtier, Thomas Culpeper, and another man behind her husband's back, and she was also linked to having a pre-contract of marriage with another man, Francis Derham. But Catherine lost her head inside of the Tower of London also, and she was executed on the scaffold on Tower Green, but she was not allowed a swordsman like Anne, and Catherine was executed by axe. Her head was taken off roughly in one swift blow of the weapon, and Catherine was not given any mercy in death, and she was forced to kneel in sawdust on the scaffold to soak up her blood, and Anne Boleyn was given a huge amount of black velvet to line the scaffold. But following Catherine's execution, there was little information as to what happened to her burial. She was taken into the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula and was thrown into a rough grave, and it's believed she was buried near to Anne Boleyn, but her body was then covered in quicklime on the orders of Henry VIII to literally wipe her off the face of the earth. But this would not be the end of the queens who lost their heads inside the Tower of London. Lady Jane Grey was executed inside of the Tower on the scaffold, and she is remembered as the 9-day queen who came onto the throne following the death of Henry's son, Edward VI. Jane was a Protestant, and she was then turned on by the Privy Council, who supported the rebellious Mary I. Mary was known as Bloody Mary, and Jane then became a prisoner of Mary inside the walls of the Tower of London. She was then sentenced to death for treason, and she was beheaded by axe within the tower on the same scaffold again. It was claimed regarding Jane's body that she was still lying on the scaffold later that day, and that there was an extraordinary amount of blood which had come from such a small body. But then later that evening, inside the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, the remains of Jane were interred in the chapel near to the bodies of the other 2 queens. However, during the Victorian times, there was a significant amount of work carried out inside of the chapel. The Queen was not impressed that the chapel, which was the burial site of 3 queens, had fallen into disrepair, and that the bones of the queens were being held in this place which was falling into ruin. The pavement of the chapel had become uneven in places, and it was dangerous, and the flooring was then to be fixed. But with this the stones were lifted, and the ground was excavated, and the bodies within the chapel were then unearthed. It was worried that the remains had been desecrated, but the remains of many prominent Tudor and Stuart figures were found, and they were then identified. Specifically, the body of Anne Boleyn was found, and her remains were located. The burial of Anne had been disturbed as another woman's corpse had interfered with her burial location, and the Queen's physician was dispatched to describe the body and identify it, and he confirmed that this was Anne Boleyn. He wrote that the bones of the head indicate a well-formed and round skull with an intellectual forehead, straight orbital ridge, large eyes, oval face, and rather square full chin. The remains of the vertebra and the bones of the lower limbs indicate a well-formed woman of middle height, with a short and slender neck. The ribs show depth and roundness of chest. The hand and feet bones indicate delicate and well-shaped hands and feet, with tapering fingers and a narrow foot. Dr. Mowat was convinced that this was Anne Boleyn, and that this woman had lost her head at the blade of a sharp weapon, such as a sword, but also found inside of the chapel were the remains of Margaret Pole, the Countess of Salisbury, who was executed during the reign of Henry VIII, and she had royal blood, being a member of the Plantagenet family. However, it was also discovered that there were some decayed remains and small amounts of bone found near to Margaret Pole, and these were then attributed to Katherine Howard. The remains were not full and were just fragments, but these were then collected. The search was then on for the remains of Lady Jane Grey, and it was said she was buried on the west side of the chancel inside of the chapel, and work was not carried out on this part of the chapel. This meant that the remains of Lady Jane Grey were not discovered. But one theory is that there may have never been anything to find of Jane, as she was just a teenager like Katherine Howard was. This is because her bones may not have fully hardened and developed, and that her bones may not have stood the test of time in the ground. But Jane was buried close to where her husband was, as Mary I did allow this for Jane. There are other accounts that Lady Jane Grey was discovered, and that she may have been placed inside of a new lead casket before she was prepared for reburial, but this is similar to Katherine Howard, as it's claimed that her remains were also never discovered, and Henry VIII may have been successful in his attempts to wipe his 5th wife off the face of the earth. But after the repair work occurred inside of the Tower of London's chapel, the plan was drawn up to inter the remains of the high-profile individuals under the high altar. The caskets were taken into the chapel, and a priest oversaw their careful burial, and a note was made of the positions of these. This means that today there are 3 Tudor queens who are laid to rest practically in the same grave under the high altar of the Tower of London. Queen Anne Boleyn is buried next to the high altar, next to her brother George Boleyn in the front row, and Katherine Howard is also buried next to Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford, who was executed following her. She is on the front row, but then on the second row, behind Anne Boleyn, is Lady Jane Grey, the 9-day Queen. Laid to rest amongst them are a number of other prominent royals and officials, including James Scott, the illegitimate rebel son of Charles II. But today, the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula is remarkable and is a place to visit. When I visited recently, I was taken aback at the sight of a beefeater having a quiet prayer at the burial site of Anne Boleyn. It is rare that the queens are buried together in the same grave, but it is even rarer that they are buried close to the place of their executions. But Anne Boleyn, Katherine Howard, and Lady Jane Grey never made it out of the Tower alive, and 500 years on, they are still there. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.